Hello and welcome to the Corporate Facility Council's first Wednesday webinar, The Art of Telling Your Story, presented by Lori Gilmer of Facility Engineering Associates. Next slide, please. I do want to let everyone know they have been muted for audio quality. If you do have any questions at any time during the webinar, please feel free and type them into the question box on your control panel, and I'll be happy to present them to Lori at the end of the webinar. And I do want to let you know that this webinar is being recorded, and an archive will be posted to the CFC website, which is ifmacfc.org. We'd love for you to check that out. And also, if you would like a PDF copy of the PowerPoint, you can go ahead and download that now on your control panel under the handout section. And now it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Lori Gilmer. She has the whole alphabet soup, PE, CFM, SFP, Lead AP, and FMP. A lot of you know her as being an IFMA instructor, and she's also on the IFMA Board of Directors. And she is past IFMA Sustainability Facility Credential Scheme Committee Chair. And she's also the co-author of the International Facility Management Association's second annual Sustainability How-To Guide series, the EPA's Energy Star Portfolio Manager. So at this time, I'm very happy to turn it over to Lori. Lori, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Josh. Well, welcome to today's presentation. As Josh said, it's called The Art of Telling Your Story. This topic comes born out of a lot of conversations with facility managers, especially through teaching engagements and talking with people and understanding that there are a lot of needs with facilities. And one of the concepts that we continually land on is we have in FM, we have the charge to operate facilities well and to support the business mission, at the same time balancing expectations of the occupants and then stakeholder needs. So we're trying to keep it all together and figure out, how do you keep this going? As we think about that, and as we look at that challenge, there are a few things that are really must-dos for the facility manager. We need to be able to speak the language of finance, and we need to be able to present a compelling business case for the measures that we want to enact. The compelling business case is so much more about the presentation than it is just the data. I think one of the things that we find is we sometimes think we've said what needs to be done, and it still doesn't get taken up. It doesn't get acted upon. People don't get how important it is. And part of that is how we present the very nature of what it is that we need to do. So we're going to talk today about some of the hard skills, kind of the finance and data aspects, and then we're going to look at the soft skills, the messaging, looking at anchors, looking at biases. So our agenda today is to look at that financial story. This is kind of the nitty-gritty, digging into finance a little bit. This is not a finance course. We're also going to look at how people think and then how to deliver that message, and we'll look at a couple of examples to help illustrate those points. One of the things that we see continually in facilities is this idea that facilities is a cost center. We often start with this concept. And the thought is money is just kind of pouring out the windows of the facility. We are sucking up resources that could otherwise be used for other things, and facilities is just sort of a necessary evil. One of the things I'd like to challenge is that idea. It's really not that facilities is a cost center. May be on paper, but I submit to you that what we really need to be thinking about is facilities as being an investment in organizational success. Without the undergirding and the support of facilities and its essential operation, the organization cannot achieve its mission, which begs the question, what is important to the organization? What is its mission, its vision, its values? And we talk about this in terms of, a lot of times we talk about this as kind of these big things that get put on websites and sometimes put on cards. But really for the FM, understanding what is key to the organization is really key to your success in a successful facility management group. What the FM is about needs to be inextricably linked to what the organization is about. Another way to say that is, whatever is important to the organization, so it must be important to you. So embracing that is going to help us understand that. So we spend some time in facility planning and in thinking and understanding, what is it that's key to that organization? What is it really about? This is a map that you're seeing now. The slide is entitled Alignment. And what we're really getting at here is the need to understand the alignment between the organization and then the things that support that. And in this case, it's facilities. So as we think about the organization and what it's about, the mission, the vision, the values, that's going to inform us as to what the facility management drivers need to be. Again, they need to be connected to living out what this organization is about for everyone to understand it and for the message to be successful. And you'll see that in facility management, we've got drivers, we've got a plan. A lot of us live our daily lives down in that bottom part of the plan, that operational planning where we have measurement, monitoring, reporting, kind of the daily tasks that exist every day. And what's important to note is that those are going to be the must-dos that we're really comfortable with every day, but they need to be firmly rooted in the facility management drivers that are firmly rooted in what the organization is about. So this is a way to kind of organize and talk about that information. As you think about how we measure and understand our success, we talk a lot about KPIs. And what's really funny to me, and kind of when you dig into the KPI subject, a lot of us talk about KPIs. And what we really mean is metrics. So I'll distinguish those things. Metrics are anything that you can measure. So we have a lot of different metrics. KPIs are those core metrics that define your top level success. I have a quick example, one that's it's a hotel. If you were to think about a hotel, and at the top level, what is really most important to that hotel success, you might find a KPI that looks something like filling rooms. We want to make sure that we have a high occupancy rate. So we're constantly monitoring what that percentage rate is on a daily basis. That is key to the business. But at a lower down metrics level, we might look at, are the rooms clean? Are they available when we need them? That's going to feed into our ability to maintain a good hotel with a high occupancy rate. There's other influencing factors, but that's kind of, again, we're looking at tight and tiny metrics. And then the KPI. The KPI is really all about keeping that hotel filled. That's our big point. So as we think about those metrics in our organization, we're looking for those things, those few things, I typically like to think 3 to 5, that are going to be linked to our topmost success. Now, if you were to map this out, your map might look something like this, where you have KPIs that are at those very top levels of the organization. So think about the FM director, the facility manager, you might exist at that level. And then we have where we see things like customer satisfaction, downtime, business continuity, corporate social responsibility. Again, very big concepts. Distilling down into that at the management level, you might see things like budget variance, our ability to adhere to a budget, our productivity. Are we environmentally compliant? Are we safe and secure? Then down to the process metrics, which again is where a lot of us live our daily lives. This is where we look at work order management, PM compliance. Are we getting work orders done? Have we trained staff? What is our system downtime? So you can start to see that these are very detailed metrics folding up into this very large picture. And sometimes I think a lot of us have an inherent sense of this concept, but sometimes we don't map it out, or we sort of link everything together, and it's very difficult to articulate. Sometimes mapping it out is a little bit easier and helps us understand the difference between the dailies and kind of the big picture. So it's another way to put it is that right-hand map where you see tactical all the way up to strategic. So we've got kind of the messy data, the everyday, reaching all the way up to the strategic level, these big things that we're looking to achieve and these big areas that we're looking to influence. Which gets to your financial story. So in looking at the financial story, the facility manager has a lot of things under their care. And we need to understand really the life cycle view. A lot of times we have the short cycle view where we're looking at what happens in a year, what happens in a month, and we really don't look beyond that. But really, our understanding of facilities extends so much beyond 1 year. The spend might be on a yearly basis, but our story is much bigger than that. Now, if you look at this life cycle, this is kind of a typical one. It starts with that planning, design, construction, startup commissioning. Then it moves over into what is really classically the facilities world, the operations and maintenance, again, where we spend most of our time and really where the facility lives most of its life. And then we have those repairs and capital renewals as well. So we're kind of in that 5, 6, 7 category on a regular basis. And then at the end of the facility's life, we're at the disposal point. You could apply this to a system, you can apply this to a building. This is kind of how it lays out. And again, we're spending a lot of our time on that 5, 6, 7, 8 realm. What we need to understand is that total picture, understanding where we have influence and what's going to happen as the facility lives its life. Now, in terms of, we've been really pushing on facility management to understand this concept of total cost of ownership, looking at a long-term life cycle view, but we're at the same time challenged with financial plans that don't look very long-term. So we still have to, and are still challenged with connecting those dots, particularly at the financial level. So there's a few things that we're going to talk about in the next little section here. We'll talk about kind of basics of money, looking at capital versus operating budgets, understanding capitalization rates, understanding expected rate of return, and why is that even important? And then looking at some tools. And you may be familiar with this. Some are more familiar, some don't get into the details. We're going to go over this at a pretty high level. If you thought about a capital budget, the capital budget is typically these big things. They tend to be things that are in excess of 1 year on the spend. They tend to be larger value items. So you might think about repairs and replacements, high dollar value again. We think about the things that'll extend our service lives, anything that's, again, over that 1 year. So systems reaching the end of their useful life, we're looking again at repair and replacement. If you thought about what your capital budget needs to be, well, you'd probably like it to be more than it is in most cases. The conventional wisdom in the industry has been that it should be around 2 to 4% of your replacement value of your facility. So if you looked at total value of your facility and you said, what should my budget be on average? 2 to 4% is the conventional wisdom of where that number wants to be. I will tell you that most people don't actually get that. That a lot of people are below the 2% line, and many of us continue to have those challenges of what we believe is insufficient budgeting, and so we're challenged with prioritizing our needs. But again, understanding that difference in capital versus operating. So operating is looking at more the daily things. This is the routine maintenance, our utilities, the things that we're doing in our facilities every single day. These tend to be not insufficient amounts of money, but they're not capitalized. You're not you treat them a little bit differently from a financial end. So the regular services that are exhibited every day, these are the things that we're budgeting every year for on a regular and routine basis. The capital tends to be a bit more planned, tend to be a bit bigger, tend to have a different way of hitting our budgets and a different way of being handled for tax purposes as well. We tend to invite finance in to help us understand how they're going to look at the financial decisions on the outside the operating budget. The capitalization rate, this is another term to talk about, otherwise known as what can you do with a dollar. And one of the things that's important to understand about the capitalization rate, the classic definition of that is it's a gauge of profitability, but it's looking at your net operating income divided by your market value, and that's by your current market value. So if you had something like a facility that was bringing in $125,000 a year after all of its expenses, and you paid $900,000 for that facility, you'd have a capitalization rate of 13.89%. If you bumped that up to $450,000 a year, if you had another facility that you were comparing its capitalization rate to, and you were bringing in a net income of $450,000 and you'd paid $900,000, you would now have a 50% capitalization rate. So you can start to see it's an index you can use for comparison of performance of facilities. or in comparison sometimes of investment opportunities, it is one element in the financial story. It doesn't tell you everything. It doesn't tell you anything about the history of the facilities, the amount that you might need to invest, et cetera, et cetera. So again, it's one metric. The idea with the capitalization rate in facilities is understanding within your financial department how the finance department thinks about money. And as you think about investments in the facility, as you think about what you need to be spending money on, we're thinking about, is there money coming back? Is it really just, are you just spending, or is there some money coming back? How do we put that financial picture in terms that the finance people can understand and that leadership who's making bigger decisions can understand? So we put it in their terminology and phrase it not as just, hey, I need $1 million to replace this HVAC system, but also helping to understand, do we have any kind of capitalization rate, or what are the other impacts, which we're going to talk about other impacts in just a few minutes. There's a few terms to understand as well in terms of finance terms. And a lot of this goes back to, these are kind of the simplified finance terms. If you are a financial person, this might be painfully simple to you. For a lot of people in facilities, this is kind of a lot of where we live when we deal with finance. We keep it pretty simple. There's one called payback period, simple payback period. We have return on investments, net present value, and internal rate of return. We're going to talk through a couple of examples with these terms. Simple payback period is really looking at the cost of a project divided by its annual expected savings. So for example, if I thought something I was going to spend, this happens a lot in energy projects, if I'm going to spend $25,000 on implementing a measure, let's say it's lighting. I'm going to implement a new lighting scheme, and I'm expecting I'm going to save $5,000 a year in spending this $25,000. I'm going to have a simple payback period of 5 years. Pretty straightforward. Again, that's a really, really basic way to look at it. If you looked at return on investment, it's the reciprocal of that. We're looking at how much are you going to get back divided by the amount of the investment. So it would be $5,000 a year, and what was my investment? It was $25,000, so I'm going to get a 20% ROI. Net present value is looking at, it's basically looking at the future, all of your cash inputs, your current, what your spend is going to be in the future into that, whatever your term is. So if I have a term of 5 years, let's say, what are my annual costs? What is the revenue that I might derive out of this measure? And is there any kind of salvage value at the end? And I pull that money all the way back to the current year so that I can compare very often different measures and understand what's the total value of this thing that I'm looking at doing. And then internal rate of return, we're looking for when does the investment pay for itself? How long is it going to take for us to get our money back? So those are a few simple terms we're going to carry forward. This is a diagram. It's a finance diagram that looks at we've got to spend an initial cost in year 0. So we're gonna put some money out, a big chunk. We've got a big red line. Then we're going to spend some money. In this case, it's maintenance. So we're going to spend a certain amount of money every year to maintain. Let's just pretend this is a system. So I'm going to spend a lot of money to put it in, and then every year for 5 years, I'm going to put some money out. And I believe I'm going to get some money back, and perhaps in the form of energy savings. So there's money back and spending less. And then at the end of this 5 year, and I'm defining the system as having a 5-year service life. So at the end of 5 years, I believe in this model, there will be a salvage value, and it's going to be X. So if I were to then take a look at this if I wanted to bring it back to net present value, I would look at that first cost. I would then look at my money outflow every year and add those two together, and then to that I add my money back in energy savings as well as my salvage value. And this helps me understand what is that total investment, inflows, outflows, where's the bottom line? Let's understand what that money really looks like. What is that total all in over the life cycle? Now, the challenge is, and we're going to address this in just a little bit, is a lot of times the story of finance and the story of any ask in facilities is told around that 0-year mark. Everyone wants to know, what's our first cost? How much money are you going to ask me for right now? Do we even have that money right now? And so we're challenged with, it might be a $50,000 expenditure. Do we have $50,000? And it might be that we will be money ahead if we can implement this new system. We'll be money ahead if we look at it at a 5-year rate. But if we look at it today, it just looks like money out the door. So this is a challenge as we think about our financial tools and we look at how our organization thinks about its spending, how it thinks about money, and how we can capture that story and help present a compelling business case that helps support our facility and that mission and that vision of what we're about. So we're trying to understand kind of that the hard skills, the nuts and bolts of money, and then we're putting that together with how people think. So as we think about how people think, there's some interesting research and some really some great books. I love this subject. This is a really fun one for me in looking at how do people take in information? How do we make decisions? We like to think of ourselves as being data-driven people and that we're making rational decisions all of the time, constantly weighing things. But actually, our brains take a lot of shortcuts, and there's some different ways to look at this. And it's useful to understand this as you think about preparing your own business case in facilities and looking at how to frame information for people, understanding how they think and where our brains immediately like to go is extraordinarily informative in preparing that business case because it's not just about the data. So framing effects speak to how we process information. Our brains tend to like to think about rules of thumb. Kind of goes to something really quick and easy. We have emotional responses. So in this example, you have a package of meat. Which one would you buy? Would you buy something that's 15% fat or 85% lean? Most packaging, if you shopped lately, you will see that almost all of it is in that right side. We like to think about how healthy it is for us. Hey, it's only 85% lean. Great, or rather, it's wonderfully 85% lean. We don't want to think about the fat content. And that's all about, it's the same product, but one looks just a little bit more positive and a little bit more appealing than the other. So we're looking at where our brains like to go and the emotions that it evokes. Another way to think about framing effects is looking at treatment options. This is another one that's been well studied, different treatment options. If you had treatment option A and it presented as having a 10% mortality rate versus treatment option B, which might have a 90% survival rate, those are equal in their impacts. They both have a 10% mortality and a 90% survival implied in them. But there is an emotional reaction that we have to both options. We don't like to think about mortality typically, and people will be tempted to and generally overwhelmingly prefer treatment option B because it promotes survival, and that's what we're about. So as we think about these kinds of effects, we're thinking about, again, how do our brains take in information? Framing in facility management is very important. And as we think about our bottom line, we're wanting to increase our chances of success. Sometimes we think about that in terms of what would happen if we didn't do a project. So as you think about that, we're trying to help the recipient of the information. So think about your boss or a board of directors that you're presenting a set of solutions to. How do you help them connect and relate to the information so that it's more than just data, but they can make an informed decision and understand impact in a way that's going to link back to the facility mission, vision, values, the organizational mission, vision, values. So this is what we're ultimately trying to get to. There's another idea called anchoring, and this is a really interesting cognitive bias that we have. We basically rely heavily on the first piece of information we receive or something that harkens back to something that we remember. There was an experiment that was done at the Exploratorium in San Francisco. If you've ever been there, it is a fantastic museum, really interesting, and they do a lot. They have a number of experiments, but they have a number of them that look at how the brain thinks, how people think, how we make decisions, and it's fascinating. So they had this one experiment where visitors were primed with a story about environmental damage caused by oil tankers in the Pacific Ocean, and they were asked to communicate or to think about their willingness to make an annual contribution, and it was to save 50,000 offshore Pacific Coast seabirds from small offshore spills until ways were found to prevent spills or require tanker owners to pay for the operation. So imagine you're walking into the Exploratorium, you read this, and you're asked about what would you be willing to contribute. So visitors were they were primed with the story, and then in some cases there was no recommendation as to what they should contribute. They were just invited to contribute money. Other times they were given an anchor, like, we suggest your donation should be $5. And then another anchor was, we suggest your recommendation, or we have a recommended donation value of $400. What was really interesting is to see how people treated that. When they were recommending $5, the average donation was $20. When they recommended $400, it went up. It's well below the recommendation, but massively up from what it was before. The average donation was $143. Interesting. That doesn't tell us how many contributors there were, so that would be another interesting data point. But then in the face of no recommendation, the average donation was $64. So as we think about that, again, we've got people heavily influenced by the information they receive, and heavily influenced by recommended values that they might be that they might be asked to provide. So think about that in the facilities context as we think about, what should something cost? What should your first number be? Some facility managers are very savvy at this, and they have some back pocket numbers that they float as high numbers, and when bids come in, very often they're hoping that they're a little bit below the numbers that they floated, and everyone's happy. If they blow the budget by a factor of 2, then there's a problem. But we get very used to these kinds of anchors and promoting these things. But these are good tools in our back pockets. An anchor can also be our tendency to rely on what we think the number should be based on our past experience. The challenge with this is it's not necessarily based on the current information or current facts. It's that, and you may have been in a meeting like this where you give a cost and someone says, but last time it cost this much, or I was at a facility where we spent this much and you're now telling me it's going to be that much. So we're dealing with that as well. Looking at what should the numbers be based on. Now we also are challenged with this ourselves as we think about our own decision making and what we expect things to be, and whether or not that is reasonable and it is as it should be. Another effect is is this one called the focusing effect, and the focusing effect, it occurs when people place too much focus on one element. Rather than taking in the whole picture, they think about one thing. And you may have seen this if you've presented an idea, or you've been presented with an idea, and instead of looking at maybe life cycle cost or total cost of ownership, or what the end of day spend might be, you might focus in on the time that it's going to take to pay it back, or what the first cost is. That's usually the big one. You focus on, instead of understanding you could save $1 million, you might focus in on, yes, but it's going to cost me $50,000 to save that $1 million. That is an extraordinarily broad example, but it's again that focus. And so we're challenged now in creating our business cases with helping people understand the right kind of picture, and understanding that they're going to tend to want to go to these places where they focus or they anchor. Yet we can use those. So here's another one. This is another interesting one. This works. This is very useful in facilities, and I'll tell you how in just a second. This is loss aversion, and the idea is that losses loom larger than gains. So think about it this way. You get a flip of a coin, and if the coin shows tails, you lose $100. If it shows heads, you win 150. So you're either going to be money out or you're going to be money in. Now, the odds are 50-50. It's going to land on one side or the other. So the question is, would you accept the bet? And at what point would you accept the bet if those numbers are adjusted? So what happens is a lot of people just they don't want to lose $100. And so if you change the numbers to lose $100 or win $100, most people won't take the bet. If you change the number to $150, you start getting a few more people who are willing to take the bet. And in fact, in the experiment, the uptake number, most people started, their acceptable rate is somewhere between $150 and $250. Now, when you think about that, when you're up to $250, you're 2.5 times what your loss is. We don't want to lose. And if we have a chance of losing, we want to make sure that the win is really, really good. But we tend to really fear losses. We don't like them, and we're very non-rational in our acceptance of them. So if you were thinking about that in terms of a facility element and you looked at a roof, you might think about that cognitive bias and you might look at what happens if we don't repair the roof. Here's a roof. It is, if you're looking at this correctly, what you'll see is there's a lovely pond on top of that roof. Not quite so much that you could sail a boat on it, but it is quite deep with water. There's a problem with this roof. Looks like they've got a lot of drainage issues up there. So what happens if you don't repair the roof? Now you could stop with, the roof is flooding, we really need to repair it. We just need to repair it, it's failing, blah, 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 we could have problems. Okay, well, it's going to cost $250,000 to re-roof it. That is a very big number for a lot of people, and for your facility, it might be bigger yet. If you're thinking in terms of loss aversion and cognitive bias, there is a way to frame this problem that might get you a little bit better response and a more proactive response. So if you frame it in terms of, if we don't do that, here's what could happen. Now this, if you've never seen this before, I'll describe it. This is a picture of leaks in a roof that are coming through the ceiling. And so this particular facility has provided essentially funnels, tarp funnels, that go to drain buckets all throughout their office. This is a very emotion-provoking picture of what can happen if you don't repair that roof. This is how we might be living in our facility. Are we willing to tolerate that? Is this what we want? A very compelling argument. And we start to get, again, that emotional reaction where we might say, right, we really need to move on this rather than waiting because we're worried about the, albeit very big number. Another element to think about is this idea of engagement. People don't pay attention to boring things. It's why we love our stories. It's why we love our examples. There's a man named John Medina who he's the author of Brain Rules, phenomenally interesting book. And one of the things that he does, he's a professor at MIT, and he does a lot of research on the brain. And he figured out this idea that you really only have 10 minutes before your audience starts to check out. The brain needs time to process. We're looking at meanings and details. But after about 10 minutes, if you don't change the pace, land at a point, and then kind of reinvigorate the brain again, you lose people. So what he started doing was he textured his lectures to this 10-minute time frame. So at 10 minutes, he would have a chunk of information to convey over the course of 10 minutes, and then he'd come up with something new and interesting and exciting at the 10-minute mark, and he'd re-engage people every 10 minutes. Really changed his lecture style. Now, most of us don't have the opportunity to quite work like that, but it does illustrate a point. As we think about this in facilities, one of the things to do, and there's a couple of advice points, is start with a gist. What is it? In military terms, we talk about bottom line up front. What is the point that we're trying to get to? Then work back to the detail. You can bring your audience back by telling stories and helping them to connect emotionally to what's occurring. That doesn't mean we need to be sitting in conference rooms with Kleenex and things, but we're looking at reactions like, oh my goodness, if we don't repair this roof, We might be living with funnels in the offices. This is not where we want to be. That causes a reaction of, ew, problematic. This is not the PR message we want to send. So as we think about telling our stories and creating our plans, we're looking to connect into that emotional side of who we are as people, and making sure that we don't just stay on the data side, that we tell our story with some connection, so that we can get to where we need to be. So on delivering the message, there's a few points here. There's a few key things as you think about making that business case. Understand how your organization views its facilities. Is it a support? Does the organization get that facilities is an essential part of the organization? You can help change that message, but understand how it's thinking about its facilities and how it runs them. Is it a long-term lease? Is it a long-term own? Do you change facilities every once in a while? What is the tie of the facility to the major organizational objective? Understand how financial decisions are made. How are you setting up capital budgets and operating budgets? What are the rules for capitalization? How are we depreciating our assets? That will tell us something about how we need to frame our stories, particularly for large financial asks. And then understand how people are thinking. How is it they think in terms of framing effects and focusing biases and looking at these stories? So as you create that business case, again, a few points. First, know the outcome. What is the decision that you want? Is it, we need to replace this roof? Okay, let's get there. Perform the financial analysis. You do need the data to back this up. And then convey both the financial and the non-financial the benefits. What happens what's the ask? If we get this money to repair the roof and replace it, it's $250,000. What are our non-financial benefits? And what if we don't act? What if we don't replace this roof? Are things going to fall apart? You will be asked that question most likely. And you may be asked for a tolerance of how long can we wait if your organization is challenged with where its money goes. And then ask for what you want. That's the final point in the business case. You know the decision that you want. You create the case to show where you need to get to and why this is important. Now ask for what you want. So in looking at this and illustrating this, I have a few examples to share with you that are really interesting. And these are real world examples from real facility managers who were challenged with some of these key issues. So this is a facility, a campus, who had some key needs. And one of their key issues was they have many facilities, big campus, and they had a very, very tiny budget, a surprisingly tiny budget. So think a couple $100,000 to maintain a giant campus. It was just not enough. They knew it. Not everybody else was really understanding the point and understanding the magnitude of the problem. So they embarked upon a project. They wanted to get a multi-year plan for figuring out what they needed to correct and fix. So they had this list of existing deficiencies, and they built a prioritization of those deficiencies. They wanted to also understand capital projects. They wanted to understand how they could prioritize both the projects as well as the facilities, and they wanted everything to be in a database. They had a CMMS, and any of the information that came out of this exercise of reviewing their facilities needed to be uploadable into that system. But the bottom line is, how much money do they need to maintain their facilities? A lot of bullet points, but what's the dollar value? What are we asking for? We know what we spend now. That's going to be an anchor. What do we actually need? So this is how they did it. So they went through and they did a condition assessment, and they also did a criticality analysis. And they looked at the criticality of their various facilities against the business mission. Some facilities just had very little importance, and then other facilities were critically important. Some facilities were in really great shape, others were in very terrible shape. So on this map, this is a sort of a heat map. This is where they were in 2008. And you can see that they were in varying degrees. And that green building, by the way, is a parking garage. Great that the parking garage is in excellent condition. It was actually fairly new, but it's maybe important, but not quite critical to the mission. They have other facilities that are very, very important that are in fairly bad shape. So what they did then was figure out through this assessment, and I told you that they had a few $100,000, or let's just go in that ballpark. They figured out that they had quite a lot of money needed, and they landed on this number of investing $24 million. So over a period of 5 years, they invested $24 million to upgrade and repair their facilities using this prioritization concept. So something like the parking garage, that was great condition and it was low priority. The orange facilities in the middle were higher priority. They got some attention. And so then what they wanted to know then is how did that change 5 years later? Did it really change the picture? And so this is what they came up with. What was really interesting to me in hearing them tell this story, particularly with their leadership, is everybody knew the colors of the buildings. Everyone. It was really unusual. And I had not appreciated how important the color map became. But you had a guy who sat in the C-suite who could say, now, this facility was orange before. How did it get to yellow? What did we do to make it go to yellow? Because that upgraded. It went from below average to fair now. And he knew, and I thought, he's not even looking at the map. He's not looking at the comparative at all. But he had anchored in on the colors, and he knew what the advancement pattern was. That was a really good, kind of quick way for people to understand state without really getting into the nitty-gritty numbers, but just kind of grossly where are we at. So very nice illustration. So what they found, they were looking at their FCIs, and they had some different sites, but they prioritized their funding, and they were looking at facility condition index, and devised a plan for what their future needs would be to improve their overall facility condition index. And they're looking at the FCI is an aggregate of the various sites, so you have to appreciate that. And you're going to have some facilities that are much lower on the totem pole than others. This is another way that you could look at it. And if you looked at a 20-year study period for them, this would tell you where their categories of expenditure were. So what you saw then is that things like site, basement, superstructure, foundations, not a lot of money needed, not a lot of ask there. Where the majority of their spending was is interior finishes and HVAC, followed by roofing and exterior enclosures, and some electrical. But you've got some really big numbers. You've got over $80 million in HVAC and interior finishes. So as you think about that, and as you think about if you're building a plan to address this need over 20 years, you've got 20 years to figure out what this plan is going to be. You know where the key needs are, you know what the priorities of the buildings are, and you have some detail you can dive into to figure out what to do. Now we can start to show, as we have a leadership group who's now bought into the improvement and understands really high level what needs to be done, they're much more willing to invest because they understand the picture that they're going to be changing. So this picture was an incredibly powerful tool, which was upheld by a very detailed process of assessment. But for them, it was all about that picture. The next story is one of the National Gallery of Art. You may have been there. It's a beautiful, beautiful facility. It has a mission to preserve the United States of America, or to serve the U.S. in a national role by preserving, collecting, and exhibiting and fostering the understanding of works of art at the highest possible museum and scholarly standards. That is a heck of a mission. But the facility manager there, whose story I am borrowing, he had some challenges. It is not unusual that we have challenges getting the money that we need to do what we need to do in our facilities. But there was a gap in what their spending was. So as they looked at their funding levels against their need, they were finding that back in 2003, they've got a $4.7 million gap, $1 million gap, and they're finding that they're just not getting money, and that gap is going to grow. And in fact, it's going to grow over several years. So they started showing this, and they could show the numbers, but it didn't necessarily translate. You could see the numbers. The numbers look very, very big, and for some people, the numbers look unachievable. And sometimes when we think unachievable, unattainable, we don't think, right, this is the elephant that we need to eat. We will chip away at it. we tend to do more of an ostrich thing, and we hide our heads. We don't want to look, and we think it might just go away, or maybe it will go away when I'm no longer here, or let someone else deal with that problem. We'll just kind of gut it out for a little while. So he looked at a rise in his deferred maintenance, and he was looking at why is this happening, and over years what happens, and what's the status of my facilities. But he found that he started taking pictures, and he started showing what happened, what happens behind the scenes. So they had this back in 2011. They had a water main break, and it was a little puddle on the floor. So that upper left-hand corner picture, and they found out that it was due to a pipe breaking. It was a small pipe, which you can see on the right-hand side. So you look, and on the left-hand side, you see a little drip of water. Outside, you see some moisture. Looks kind of squishy. Nobody's really thinking that this problem is a huge deal. So then they opened up a trench, and they took out a section of pipe, and here is what he's now seeing that most people don't see. So he started showing people these pictures. Here's the condition that we're in. This is why we need to repair and replace. And it was those pictures that started to resonate and cause people to act. The picture wasn't compelling enough before. So these are the kinds of things that they're looking at. A lot of basic things, HVAC and elevator systems and electrical upgrades and whatnot. Again, to protect nature's art and to be this most excellent facility. So as we think about this plan, he was able to increase their repair funding to $5.3 million, and could then show their deferred maintenance backlog as he chips away at that. He can show that deferred maintenance log decreasing, and that would reduce their risk to their gallery and their collections that they have in the art that they're storing and presenting. So a couple of compelling stories, how people used pictures and maps and colors to help illustrate need, sometimes in some really basic ways, undergirded by lots of detail and understanding, but illustrating what happens if you don't act. What might we, where might we be? What is that story going to be? So as you think about building that compelling business case, it is really in how you tell that story. You need to understand how your organization views its facilities. How does it think about making financial decisions, and how are people thinking? Putting that together to create that compelling business case is the difference between your ability to move forward or stay where you're at. We've called it the art of telling your story. I have this fond story that my dad and I have gone round and round on this for years. My dad has this. My dad is a very data-driven person, and he and I would go round and round because he would present something very factually, and we would say it's not, and he would bring offense somehow in his delivery, and he didn't get it. He didn't understand that it was his delivery of his request or his requirement that was causing the problem. And in his frustration and impatience, he could not, and he expressed, didn't understand why we didn't get it, me and my sister. And we said, Dad, it's not what you said, it's how you said it. Now he still hates that because his delivery is still very very logical and not always empathetic to a situation and cause. But we continue to talk about framing effects and how do you say things. But that is, for many of us in facilities, as we think about the art of telling our story, that's the difference between, again, moving the organization forward or staying stagnant. So that concludes the presentation today. And Josh, were there any questions? Did people have questions that they want to entertain?
I don't have any questions at this moment. We'll give you just a moment to go ahead and type those in. And as a reminder, you can type them into the question box on your control panel. And also a recorded copy of this presentation will be posted on the CFC website, ifmacfc.org is where it will be. And they just actually launched a new website. So you CFC members, if you have not seen the new website, I really encourage you to go see it. They did a really good job with it. And you have Lori's email address up there on the screen. So if after this presentation you have a question, certainly feel free and reach out to her. And also remind you, if you want a PDF copy of the PowerPoint, you can download that now in the control panel. And it looks like a question just came in. It says, do you find it best to stage the information over time and drip out the info, or wait to do the ask in one final summary request?
I think it depends. That's an interesting question. It depends on the situation. They're usually in a business case presentation. There's kind of a moment of recognition or a moment of presentation. But I think it is helpful for people to understand things along the way. A lot of times when you're building a business case and you're working to understand the problem, or you have a recognized problem and you're building up your cadre of information and data, getting people to come in and assess and provide pricing and whatnot so that you can present this business case. What can be helpful to do is to prime the audience ahead of time. And this is where I suspect where you might be going with the question on is it helpful to drip the information in? It's helpful to help people understand context so they're not surprised when you get them into a room and you're going to do an ask. It can be, depending on your audience, but it can be very helpful for them to understand something like, in the case of a roof replacement, understanding, hey, we're going to need to look at repairing and replacing the roof. I'm putting together information so we can make an informed decision. So you've got them already sort of thinking about this might be coming. One of the other issues with people is we tend to not like surprises, especially bad surprises. There's some people who will flat out say, I don't like surprises. I think most of us don't like to be surprised by negative situations in particular. And so sometimes helping to provide a heads up on what might be occurring or what the needs might be can be very helpful in moving the case forward.
Excellent. Okay, so hold on one second. Looks like something else just came in. Do you recommend bringing in an outside consultant to put an independent stamp on the findings? Sometimes it seems that outside consultants are more easily believed.
Yeah, again, it depends on the organization. I've seen that. I have been in situations where what I hear is the facilities department, facility manager will say something like, I already know what to do, but I can't get any traction. I need a third party to come in and independently assess this. Because I think we already know where to go and what to do, but they won't go on just my input. We need to get independent validation. Those are situations, that's a classic right out there, where you do have someone saying, I've got to have third party validation. Some of that can depend on the relationship that the facilities department has with leadership. Sometimes it has to do with the magnitude of what the problem is. So it's, in some circumstances, you may not need a third party to come in if you have that relationship that supports it. If the ask is just within the tolerance of people's ability to be able to think about and address it. Sometimes when the ask is really, really big in terms of money, there may be a request for additional validation to make sure that as we release multi-millions of dollars, that we're really going about this correctly. So that can be, so you might think it's the right way to go. It provides that additional support. So I think it tends to depend on relationship, magnitude of the value, and just how the organization is used to making decisions. There's some organizations that just really value independent analysis, and other organizations that are quite fine with their own internal team. So again, I think so much of this depends on how the organization is put together. But you understanding that is really good. It will again be the difference between your ability to move forward and maybe do nothing at all. one thing to be aware of is a stall tactic in getting third party. So if your organization says, well, we need a third party person to evaluate this super most important thing that could be compelling and ripping into our business, but we don't have the funds to do that right now. Like, okay, what do you do next? In that case, then you need to figure out how to evaluate it internally and create that understanding of what happens if we don't move forward. And that needs to be a very compelling story if the risk is high. And framing it in terms of risk to business mission is key.
Excellent. Here we have one more question. It says, we are not able to produce cost for labor and materials without a difficult mining process. We can produce hours of maintenance staff. Could that be a start in showing where the funds are being spent?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, a lot of facilities organizations have that issue of figuring out labor hours, and sometimes we don't always track labor hours against work orders or projects, again, depending on the organization. And so sometimes what we're doing is estimating. Sometimes we know kind of how much outside money has been spent on a particular project or system, but the internal we don't know. You can start looking at hours, and you can look at average burdening rates. I think one of the challenges in that kind of analysis is to come up with accuracy can sometimes be the enemy. Sometimes an estimate will get you within a reasonable ballpark. So I think sometimes the challenge can be trying to get something that's so very accurate that it takes you months and months to get a number that you can really back up with a ton of financial records, and by that time you've lost a lot of value. Your time is not as valuably spent as it could have been, and you've lost time on the project. So a challenge can be start with the hours, but also get kind of a rough estimate of what's our average spend per hour. If you looked at a rough hourly burdened rate, is there something you can kind of rule of thumb apply within your team to get a rough order of magnitude of cost impact internally? That's a quick and dirty way to do it, and usually you're going to be pretty close. We're not talking about gazillions of dollars off usually at that point, but you're looking for a sense of where are we in the magnitude of spend here.
Excellent. And actually, it's a good place to stop because we are pretty much at time. I want to thank Lori for a really wonderful presentation. And I want to thank everyone for attending, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks so much.